By this time next week, this property will belong to my son.
Yeah.
Not if I have anything to say about it.
By this time next week, this property will belong to my son. The woman standing at my gate said it the way a judge might announce a sentence. She wore a cream-colored silk dress, gold-rimmed glasses, and the expression of someone who had never expected to hear the word no. I was halfway through replacing the second wooden step on my dock when I heard the gate swing open and the crunch of gravel behind me. It was not the sound of a neighbor passing through. It was the sound of someone who already believed she owned wherever she was walking. I stood up and wiped my hands on an old work rag. The woman stopped a few feet away. Beside her stood a younger man in his early 30s. Neither introduced themselves. The woman simply adjusted her glasses and continued. My son needs a proper place to recover. This property is the perfect environment. The transfer documents are already being prepared. I looked at her. Then I looked at the cabin. Then I looked at the lake. Finally, I looked back at her. No, just one word. Nothing more. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. She tilted her head as if she had just heard a foreign language. Then she smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile worn by people who believe resistance is only temporary. I do not think you understand the situation. I do. The smile disappeared. My name is Victoria Langford. I nodded. She was clearly expecting a stronger reaction. I am the president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. Okay. Disappointment flashed across her face. People like Victoria were accustomed to letting titles do most of the work for them. This community has invested significant resources into long-term development planning. Certain properties provide greater value when utilized for the benefit of the community. I looked at the lake, then the dock, then back at her. Still no. The younger man finally spoke. You should think carefully about this. I ignored him. Victoria folded her arms. You do not understand who you are talking to. I do. And you are standing on my land. Silence settled between us. Those 5 words carried more weight than I expected. Not because they were clever, because they were true. For the first time, Victoria looked genuinely irritated. I stepped past her and picked up my toolbox. The conversation was over. At least for me. For her, it was only beginning. As I walked toward the cabin, I heard her heels grinding into the gravel. You are making a mistake. Maybe, but not the one she imagined. I stepped inside and closed the door. Through the side window, I watched Victoria and her son return to their vehicle. Before they even reached the gate, she already had her phone in her hand. Calling someone. Planning. Escalating. At the time, I had no idea what she intended to do next. But later I would realize something important. Those first few minutes at my gate were the beginning of Victoria Langford's downfall. She simply did not know it yet. The cabin had never been just a piece of real estate. My father, Harold Bennett, built it with his own hands in the early 1970s. Every beam, every plank, every nail. The place existed because he refused to hire anyone else to do the work. As a kid, I spent summers handing him tools while he worked. The floorboards sat slightly uneven because he installed them himself. The dock extended exactly where he wanted because he measured every inch himself. The windows faced the lake because he loved watching the morning light reflect across the water. Nothing about the cabin happened by accident. 12 years earlier, after my father passed away, ownership transferred to me. Since then, I had maintained everything exactly the way he wanted. Replace boards, repair siding, reinforce supports. Nothing fancy, just respect. One summer when I was 12 years old, my father spent 3 straight weekends rebuilding the dock after a storm damaged the outer section. The damage was minor. Most people would have patched it and moved on. My father was not most people. He believed if something carried your family name, it deserved to be done correctly. I still remember standing knee-deep in the water, holding a measuring tape while he checked every support post. When I asked why he cared so much about a few inches of alignment, he laughed and tapped the side of his toolbox. Because shortcuts become problems for the next generation. Years later, I would find that same toolbox in the storage shed behind the cabin. Every wrench remained in its place. Every measurement notebook remained stacked in the same order. He kept records for everything. Receipts, survey copies, property tax statements, county correspondence. At the time, I thought it was excessive. One evening while organizing papers, I asked why he saved documents nobody would ever read. He looked at me and said something I never forgot. Land is the only thing people will try to rewrite after you're gone. Paper is how you stop them. Back then, It sounded like the kind of advice older men collected over a lifetime. Decades later, sitting inside the same cabin, I would realize he had been right about every word. The cabin was never valuable because of the shoreline. It was valuable because every board, every beam, and every acre carried a piece of my family's history. That history could not be replaced. It could not be replicated. And it certainly could not be transferred because someone in an expensive suit decided they wanted it. That was why Victoria's demand sounded so absurd. She spoke about the property as if she were discussing a parking space. To me, she was talking about 40 years of family history. Inside the cabin, near the front door, hung something most visitors never noticed. A framed land survey from 1972. The edges had yellowed with age. The county stamp remained visible. Precise measurements covered every empty corner of the document. My father loved land records. As a retired engineer, he trusted numbers more than opinions. For years, I viewed the survey as little more than a family keepsake. A piece of history, nothing more. I had no idea it would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire story. The following afternoon, Victoria returned. This time she brought her son closer to the property. His name was Mason Langford, 32 years old. Expensive watch, expensive shoes. The expression of a man who had never been forced to wait for anything in his life. What caught my attention was not what Mason said. It was what he looked at. He barely looked at me. Instead, he studied the porch, the shoreline, the tree line, the dock, the pathways, the utility access routes, and the retaining wall. Every few seconds his eyes shifted somewhere else, like a developer evaluating a future project site. Not like someone searching for a place to recover. More like someone calculating property he expected to own. Victoria began speaking before I could say anything. The board has reviewed a community reallocation proposal. I almost laughed. A what? A community reallocation proposal. Mason nodded. Victoria continued. Your parcel is currently being underutilized relative to its potential contribution to community objectives. There it was. HOA language. Words designed to sound official while meaning very little. Equitable redistribution. Community optimization. Shared benefit. The usual collection of phrases. I listened for a few moments before interrupting. Which article? Victoria blinked. What? Which article in the governing documents gives you that authority? A pause followed. The board has already reviewed the legal framework. Which article? The board's authority is well established. Which article? She was becoming irritated now. We do not need to get lost in technical details. That answer told me everything. People who possess authority know exactly where it comes from. People pretending to have authority avoid specifics. Without another word, I walked inside. A minute later, I returned carrying 2 folders. One contained my deed. The other contained the official HOA governing documents I had obtained directly from county records months earlier. I placed both on the porch railing. Show me. Victoria never touched them. Instead, she stared beyond the paperwork toward the lake as if legal ownership were merely an obstacle standing between her son and the view she wanted him to have. Mason continued studying the property like a future owner. Eventually, Victoria turned around. This conversation is not finished. It is for today. The two of them walked back to their vehicle. I remained on the porch until they disappeared beyond the gate. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. Not anger. Not emotion. Planning. It felt like I had stepped into the middle of something that had started long before I knew it existed. At exactly 3:27 p.m., I opened a notebook. Then I wrote, Victoria Langford. First entry. Date. Time. Summary of conversation. Key statements. Individuals present. I had spent years working in construction engineering. Documentation came naturally. If something happened, you recorded it. If someone said something important, you wrote it down. If a dispute appeared likely, you created a record. By the end of that afternoon, I had dedicated an entire notebook to Victoria Langford. The next morning, I called a surveying company I trusted. I wanted fresh boundary verification. Not because I doubted my ownership, because I wanted current documentation. If Victoria intended to continue, I wanted records ready. Survey crews arrived later that week. Bright survey markers appeared along the property line. Everything matched the existing records perfectly. That should have ended the matter. Instead, it started something much bigger. That same night, I opened the county parcel maps on my computer. Initially, I was simply reviewing boundary information. Then I noticed something strange. A narrow strip of land running along the northern edge of the HOA office property, 30 feet wide. For years, I had assumed it belonged to the association. Apparently everyone had, including the association itself. But according to county records, the parcel belonged to someone else. My father, Harold Bennett. I stared at the screen for a long time, then checked again. Same result. Again. Same result. Finally, I wrote down the parcel number and underlined it twice. Then I opened a second county map, then a third, then an archived GIS image from several years earlier. The parcel remained there every single time. I compared tax assessment records against ownership records. I compared ownership records against historical surveys. Then I pulled out my father's framed 1972 survey and placed it beside the computer monitor. The dimensions matched. The location matched. Even the boundary descriptions matched. The more I checked, the less sense it made. According to every official record I could find, the 30-foot strip had never legally belonged to the HOA. Yet the association had paved part of it, landscaped around it, and treated it as if ownership had never been in question. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. Either nobody had ever verified the property line, or someone had verified it and chosen to ignore it. Neither explanation was good for Victoria. Around midnight, I began tracing the history of the parcel through archived county filings. Ownership transferred from my father to me exactly as expected. Taxes had been paid. Records had been maintained. Nothing was missing. Nothing was unclear. In fact, the title history was cleaner than most properties in the county. The mystery was not how I owned the strip. The mystery was how an entire HOA had spent years acting as though I did not. As I stared at the screen, a thought crossed my mind for the first time. Maybe Victoria was not trying to take my cabin despite the records. Maybe she was trying to take it because of them. I did not call anyone. I did not announce the discovery. I simply saved every record I could find. Sometimes information becomes more valuable when nobody knows you possess it. 1 week later, the first retaliation arrived. Before sunrise, I found an HOA notice beneath my front door. Official letterhead. Official formatting. Official language. According to the document, my survey markers violated Article 16C of HOA regulations. The notice ordered removal within 72 hours. Failure to comply would result in daily fines. I read it twice, then opened the governing documents and discovered a problem. Article 16C did not exist. Not in the original documents. Not in any amendment. Not anywhere. At exactly 10:18 a.m. that morning, I received written confirmation from the county clerk. The article Victoria cited was completely fictional. The HOA had no authority to prohibit survey markers placed on privately owned property. So I responded. No speeches. No threats. No arguments. Just facts. Copies of governing documents. The clerk's written confirmation. A side-by-side comparison highlighting the discrepancy. Everything went into a certified mailing envelope. I kept copies. I kept receipts. I kept tracking information. Every document entered the notebook. That afternoon, Victoria called my cell phone. I answered. She managed 2 sentences. Then I interrupted. All future communication must be in writing. Then I hung up. The feeling was strangely satisfying. Not because I had won. Because she had finally done something important. She had created a paper trail. And paper trails always lead somewhere. That evening, while sitting at the kitchen table reviewing parcel maps again, I found myself staring at the 30-foot strip beside the HOA office. Quiet. Forgotten. Ignored. A small piece of land that nobody seemed to fully understand. I saved another copy of the records. Then I wrote one final note in the notebook. I just found something they do not know I have. And now they have started leaving evidence behind. 3 days after I mailed the certified response, the situation stopped being about me alone. The first person to prove that arrived unexpectedly. Her name was Evelyn Parker. She was 73 years old and lived 2 streets away from the HOA office. When she called, her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent too long questioning her own memory. She asked if we could meet privately. The next afternoon, she arrived carrying a thick folder. She placed it on my kitchen table without saying a word. Inside were consent forms, invoices, trust agreements, property maps, and notarized records. 14 months earlier, she believed she had signed paperwork allowing decorative hedges to be planted near her backyard fence. 3 months later, she received a maintenance invoice for land she no longer owned. Buried deep inside the paperwork was a transfer document moving nearly 4,200 square feet of her backyard into a private maintenance trust. She never realized she had signed away part of her property. I did not interrupt her story. Instead, I wrote down every detail. Trust name, recording date, notary number, parcel reference. Every piece of information entered the notebook. Then I began reviewing parcel histories across Cedar Ridge. There were 49 residential properties in total. By the third day, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 12 separate easement transfers, 9 covenant modifications, 8 land adjustments, and 6 parcels that eventually ended up connected to the same limited liability company. As word quietly spread, more homeowners began reaching out. The second person was a retired Army veteran named Robert Hayes. He brought a folder containing correspondence he had received over the previous 2 years. According to HOA records, he had voluntarily granted an access easement along the side of his property. Robert insisted he had never agreed to anything of the sort. What he remembered signing was a landscaping approval form for a drainage project. Somehow, the final recorded document looked very different from what he believed he had authorized. A few days later, a widow named Carol Whitman contacted me. Her husband had handled all property matters before his death. After reviewing her records, she discovered that a narrow section of shoreline behind her home had been transferred into a maintenance agreement she had never fully understood. Then came Thomas and Linda Mercer, a retired couple who had lived in Cedar Ridge for nearly 20 years. They showed me letters demanding compliance with restrictions that did not appear anywhere in the governing documents. Individually, each story sounded like a misunderstanding. Together, they formed a pattern. Different properties, different homeowners, different circumstances. Yet the outcome was always the same. Small pieces of control quietly moved away from residents and toward organizations connected to the same people. By the end of the week, my dining table was covered with folders, surveys, notices, and transfer records. What started as a dispute over one cabin was beginning to look like a long-running system operating in plain sight. This was no longer a dispute between a homeowner and an HOA president. Something much larger was hiding behind the paperwork. The breakthrough came late one evening. Every suspicious transfer eventually pointed toward the same company, Ridge Shore Development Holdings, LLC. I searched corporate filings and registration records. Then I found the name that changed everything. Mason Langford, registered agent. At first, I assumed the connection might be coincidence. Then I checked the company formation date. Ridge Shore Development Holdings, LLC had been established nearly 2 years before Victoria first appeared at my gate. That alone was interesting. What made it significant was the timeline that followed. Several of the disputed easement transfers occurred within months of the company's creation. A shoreline access agreement appeared here. A maintenance corridor appeared there. A small parcel adjustment appeared somewhere else. Individually, none of them seemed important. Together, they formed a chain. Every acquisition moved the company one step closer to controlling a continuous section of valuable lakefront property. I printed maps and spread them across my kitchen table. Then I highlighted every parcel connected to the LLC. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The properties were not random. They followed the shoreline like pieces of a puzzle. One by one, the gaps had disappeared. Only a few remained. My cabin sat directly in the center of the largest remaining gap. For the first time, I stopped viewing Victoria as an overbearing HOA president. Instead, I began seeing her as the public face of a much larger strategy. Mason was not simply benefiting from the plan. The records suggested he had been helping build it from the very beginning. Suddenly, the entire story looked different. Victoria had never wanted my cabin simply because her son needed a peaceful place to recover. That explanation had always been a cover. Mason was part of the operation from the beginning. The company had quietly accumulated strips of shoreline, easements, and access corridors across the community. Then I found the reason my property mattered. My cabin occupied the last remaining section needed to create continuous lakefront frontage along the eastern shoreline. Without my parcel, the development plan failed. Without my land, they could not qualify for the permit they wanted. That realization changed everything. They did not merely want my property. They needed it. For weeks they had acted like they were doing me a favor. The records told a very different story. My cabin was not an inconvenience. It was the missing piece. Once I understood the scope of the operation, I stopped working alone. The first call went to investigative reporter Daniel Reyes. Years earlier, we had crossed paths during a zoning dispute. When he answered, I asked a simple question. Are you interested in a story involving HOA governance and property fraud? There was a pause. Then he replied, How much evidence do you have? Enough to start. At the same time, I hired attorney Rebecca Cole, a specialist in community association law. She spent 2 days reviewing documents before delivering her opinion. This is not random mismanagement, she said. These documents appear designed to pressure homeowners into compliance while creating the appearance of legitimacy. A week later, Victoria called an emergency HOA meeting. The stated purpose involved compliance enforcement and community standards. The real purpose was obvious. She wanted an official record against me. Cedar Ridge contained 49 homes. Only 15 households attended. The bylaws required 35% participation to establish quorum. Victoria never mentioned that fact. She called for votes anyway. Before the vote began, a homeowner named George Whitaker stood up from the third row. George had lived in Cedar Ridge longer than most board members and rarely spoke during meetings. When he did, people listened. He held up a copy of the bylaws and asked a simple question. Can someone confirm we have quorum? The room became noticeably quieter. Several residents turned toward the board table. Victoria glanced down at her notes. Then she smiled and thanked George for his question without actually answering it. The board has reviewed all procedural requirements, she said. Tonight we are focused on moving the community forward. George did not sit down. That was not my question. Another pause followed. One board member began shuffling papers. Another stared down at the table as if suddenly fascinated by the agenda packet. Nobody volunteered a number. Nobody announced attendance totals. Nobody explained how quorum had been calculated. Victoria simply moved to the next item on the agenda. A few homeowners exchanged uneasy looks. They knew something was wrong, even if they could not yet explain exactly what it was. The tension grew as additional questions were ignored. Every request for clarification received the same polished response. General statements. No specifics. Broad authority. No documentation. By the time voting started, the atmosphere felt less like a community meeting and more like a decision that had already been made before anyone entered the room. The board wanted compliance. The residents wanted answers. Only one side appeared interested in transparency. 12 hands supported her proposal. 2 residents abstained. Evelyn Parker voted against it. Victoria immediately declared the motion passed. I never argued. I never raised my voice. Instead, I wrote everything down. Failure to verify quorum. Ineligible households voting. Missing membership records. Refusal to answer procedural questions. Every violation entered my notebook. The following morning, Rebecca reviewed the meeting record. The vote was invalid for multiple independent reasons. Victoria believed she was creating authority. In reality, she was creating evidence. Around 1:53 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, someone entered my property. They did not kick in a door. They did not break a window. They did not vandalize anything. Instead, they walked directly to 4 survey markers near the eastern boundary and moved them. Not removed. Moved. Each stake had been shifted just enough to create confusion about the actual property line. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. What they did not know was that I had installed motion-activated cameras the week before. At sunrise, I reviewed the footage. Then I watched it again. Then a third time. A figure wearing dark clothing appeared on screen, carrying what looked like a rubber mallet. The person spent less than 5 minutes on the property before disappearing into the darkness. I copied the footage to secure storage, photographed every disturbed marker, restored the original locations using survey records, and opened a new evidence folder labeled Physical Interference. 2 weeks later, the situation became personal. I returned to the cabin one afternoon and immediately sensed something was wrong. The front door was unlocked. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing appeared broken. Yet the cabin carried the uncomfortable stillness of a place that had been entered and carefully rearranged. Then I saw the shelf. A cedar box sat open. The box had belonged to my late wife, Margaret. Inside it were the few items I treasured most. A folded letter she wrote during our first year of marriage. A pressed flower from a family trip. A commemorative coin from the year we were married. Someone had removed every item and arranged them in a loose semicircle beneath the shelf. Not destroyed. Not stolen. Displayed. On the kitchen table sat a single document held down by a salt shaker. Property transfer agreement. Fully prepared. Fully typed. Already signed by Victoria Langford. For a moment, I barely looked at the transfer agreement. My attention remained fixed on the cedar box. The sight of it sitting open on the shelf felt worse than any threat, fine, or legal notice Victoria had sent. Whoever entered the cabin could have searched drawers, opened cabinets, or taken photographs. Instead, they chose the one thing they knew would hurt the most. I slowly walked toward the box and knelt beside it. My hands hovered over the items without touching them. The folded letter sat near the center of the arrangement. I recognized it immediately. Margaret had written it more than 20 years earlier during a difficult period when my work kept me away from home for weeks at a time. I unfolded the paper carefully. The edges had become fragile with age. Her handwriting remained unmistakable. Near the bottom of the page was a sentence I had not read in years. "Promise me this place always stays in the family." I stared at those words for a long time. The cabin had never mattered because it sat beside a lake. It mattered because it carried the memories of the people who built my life. My father had built the structure with his hands. Margaret had filled it with meaning. Every holiday, every family gathering, every milestone seemed tied to this place. Suddenly, the entire campaign against me felt different. This was no longer about property acquisition, development permits, or HOA authority. They were attempting to turn family history into a transaction. For the first time since Victoria appeared at my gate, anger replaced frustration. Not reckless anger. Focused anger. The kind that comes when something valuable is threatened. I folded Margaret's letter and placed it back exactly where it belonged. Then I looked at the transfer agreement one more time. The document no longer felt intimidating. It felt desperate. Whoever left it behind believed emotional pressure would succeed where legal pressure had failed. They were wrong. Standing there in the cabin, I realized something important. I was finished defending myself. From that moment forward, I intended to expose everything. My information remained blank. Waiting. I stood there for several minutes staring at the document. Then I carefully returned every item to the cedar box exactly where it belonged. Closed the lid. Straightened the photographs. Then I made 3 calls. The first call went to the sheriff's office. The second went to attorney Rebecca Cole. The third went to reporter Daniel Reyes. For the first time since this started, I was no longer simply documenting events. I was preparing to end them. 3 days after the break-in, I received a voicemail from someone I did not recognize. The message was brief. "My name is Stephen Holloway. I think we need to talk." Somewhere outside the neighborhood. We met at a diner 13 miles east of Cedar Ridge. Stephen had served as HOA secretary until a few months earlier. He looked nervous from the moment he walked in. After ordering coffee, he slid a padded envelope across the table. Victoria pushed me out after I questioned a $24,000 reserve fund expense that had no invoice behind it. Inside the envelope were photocopies of internal HOA records. Several pages immediately caught my attention because they were marked internal discussion only. Unlike official meeting minutes, these notes contained direct quotes rather than carefully polished summaries. One entry described a discussion about homeowners who had resisted signing transfer agreements. According to the notes, Victoria dismissed concerns about transparency with a single sentence. Most owners never read what they sign. Another page recorded a conversation between Victoria and Mason regarding shoreline acquisitions. A board member questioned whether repeated pressure campaigns might attract legal scrutiny. Mason's response was written almost word for word. Eventually, they all sell. A third document was even more revealing. During a closed-door discussion about my cabin, one board member reportedly asked whether pursuing the property was worth the growing risk. Victoria responded by saying that obtaining the lakefront parcel would unlock opportunities worth far more than any potential dispute. Reading those pages felt different from reviewing surveys or corporate filings. Legal documents revealed what people had done. These notes revealed what they believed. The language was not that of community leaders trying to improve a neighborhood. It was the language of people viewing homeowners as obstacles to be managed. For months, I had suspected the operation was deliberate. Now I was holding proof that it had been discussed openly behind closed doors. The envelope did not simply contain evidence. It contained motive. 11 separate meeting minutes that had never been entered into official records. Several sessions had taken place after meetings were supposedly adjourned. Some involved only 3 board members. Victoria and Mason discussed specific properties, specific homeowners, and the order in which transfer agreements would be presented. Then I found my name. 8 months before Victoria first appeared at my gate. A note beside it read, "Lakefront parcel. Priority acquisition target." That single sentence changed the entire story. The operation had been planned long before I ever knew it existed. That evening, Rebecca reviewed everything. The fraudulent documents, the unauthorized transfers, the meeting minutes, the LLC filings, the break-in evidence, the transfer agreement, the surveillance footage. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair. "There is enough here for fraud, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty, deceptive practices, and unlawful entry investigations." She paused. "When do you want to move?" "1 week." I already knew what I was going to do. The forgotten 30-foot parcel beside the HOA office had been waiting quietly for decades. I contacted a fencing contractor I had worked with years earlier. We reviewed county records, deed descriptions, and survey coordinates. Every permit application was filed properly. Every measurement was verified. Every approval was documented. By the end of the week, everything was ready. Monday morning arrived. At 6:42 a.m., the first steel fence post went into the ground. The permit was valid. The survey was valid. The parcel belonged to me. The crew worked quickly. 6-foot black steel fencing rose along the exact boundary line defined by my father's deed decades earlier. At 8:11 a.m., Victoria Langford's silver SUV pulled into the HOA office parking lot. Nearly 1/3 of the fence line was already standing. She marched toward the crew, demanding work stop immediately. The foreman handed her a copy of the permit. Then another copy showing parcel ownership. Then another copy showing the approved survey. The sound she made was not quite a word. 30 minutes later, she called law enforcement. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived and reviewed everything. Permits, surveys, parcel records, deeds. Within 20 minutes, they confirmed what Victoria least wanted to hear. The land was privately owned. The construction was lawful. There was no basis to stop it. News spread through Cedar Ridge faster than I expected. Within an hour, residents began stepping out onto porches, gathering near driveways, and quietly making their way toward the HOA office. Some stood with folded arms. Others carried copies of notices, fines, and compliance letters they had received over the years. Nobody needed an explanation. They understood what they were looking at. For the first time, the invisible assumptions that had governed the neighborhood were being tested against actual property records. Victoria refused to accept it. I watched her pace across the parking lot while speaking rapidly into her phone. A few minutes later, she announced that her attorney would be reviewing the situation immediately. The senior deputy listened patiently before asking a simple question. "Do you have documentation showing ownership of this parcel?" Victoria produced several folders. The deputy reviewed them carefully, then compared them against the deed, survey, and county records I had provided. Several minutes passed. Finally, he closed the folder and handed it back. "Ma'am, these documents do not establish ownership of the parcel in question." Around that time, Daniel Reyes and his camera crew began recording everything. They filmed the survey markers. They filmed the county maps. They filmed the deputies reviewing records. Most importantly, they filmed the final section of fence being installed. As the last panel was secured into place, a quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. The moment felt larger than that. It felt like the end of a long deception. By mid-morning, neighbors began gathering. Evelyn Parker arrived. Stephen Holloway arrived. Several homeowners quietly affected by previous transfers arrived. Then Daniel Reyes arrived with a camera crew. At exactly 9:58 a.m., I walked across the parking lot carrying 3 thick manila envelopes. One went to the senior deputy. One went to Daniel. One went to a representative from the district attorney's office, arranged through Rebecca. Inside were 118 pages of organized evidence. Certified surveys. Fraudulent amendments. Invalid HOA records. Parcel transfer histories. Secret meeting minutes. Break-in reports. Transfer agreements. LLC filings. Financial records. Everything tabbed. Everything indexed. Everything impossible to ignore. The fence mattered because it made reality visible. The HOA office had not moved. The parking lot had not moved. The road had not moved, but the invisible line between assumption and ownership now stood in steel and concrete for everyone to see. Victoria could argue with homeowners. She could manipulate meetings. She could pressure neighbors. She could not argue with a deed, a survey, a permit, and a prosecutor holding evidence. For weeks later, formal investigations began. Ridge Shore Development Holdings LLC became the subject of civil review. Development funding was suspended. Property transfers were examined. 6 weeks later, Cedar Ridge held a court-supervised board election. Turnout became the highest in community history. Evelyn Parker won a seat on the new board. A month later, she called me and said only 6 words. I got my backyard back. The disputed transfers were eventually reversed. The community slowly recovered. Late that autumn, I returned to the cabin. The survey markers remained untouched. The dock stood solid beneath my feet. Inside, Margaret's cedar box rested exactly where it belonged. For the first time in months, everything felt right. Then that evening my phone buzzed. Unknown number. No name. No explanation. Only a GPS coordinate and a single sentence. They were not working alone. The coordinates pointed to another shoreline property several miles beyond Cedar Ridge. A new parcel. A new name. A new survey filing. I opened the same notebook I had started the day Victoria Langford first walked onto my property. Then I wrote down the new name. Because a boundary is not just a line in the dirt. It is a deed. It is a survey. It is a record. And sooner or later, the people who try to cross it are the ones who get trapped.